So just making sure all my stream and stuff is set up before we start. Whoa. Okay. Right, everything seems to be in order. Alright, we'll kickstart with this week's video. So this week we're going to go over train. We're going to follow a similar format to what we've been doing in the last few weeks, but we're going to be going over a couple different things to what we've done in the past. So typically in the past I've talked over map control, and then I've talked about how we can set up for map control. Now we're going to do something similar, but we're going to change it up a little bit, where we're going to be talking about how we can deal with protocols to map control. So for example, if the enemy do X, then we can do Y. And this should hopefully give a couple more ideas on how to properly react to what the opponents are doing on the T and CT side, and should just be better overall for teaching a couple of basic concepts. So let's get started. Now I'm going to try and quickly space these two out. Hopefully we can get this looking decent. Right, so there's a couple of main things that we're going to focus on. We're going to maybe join the server a couple of times to check in and show a couple of different concepts which I'm talking about. But let's get started with the main point. So map overview. This one's fairly simple. We're on train this time. This is a much simpler map from the other maps that we've talked over before. When we're looking at how many entrances there are to the site, there's only 5 places where you can enter, which are marked in these locations right here. If we just get rid of this whole thing, we have main, we have first line towards Ivy, we have pop, we have lower, and we have upper, also known as heaven and lower behind white train. So these are places where the T's can enter out onto the sites when they're choosing where to attack. Now, what makes this special from other maps is, for example, let's take Mirage. So there's 6 entry points when you're coming into sites, which means when you only have 5 players, you can't defend all 6 places. Now, where Train has only 5 entry points, which is a little bit more than some other maps. Some other maps have 4. However, it does mean that you can hold all positions all the time, and the only thing that you need to really worry about is obviously when you're rotating players or when they're taking map control, that these positions aren't being overlooked. So the good thing about Train, you can always check all positions at all times, which is really, really good when defending on the CT side. This typically pushes this map to be more of a CT-sided map. We're looking at maybe around 9 rounds to 6, depending on if you get pistol or not, as it's quite easy to defend depending on how the opponents are taking map control and how they're putting pressure on each site. So that's the site entrances. We have 5, fairly simple. There's no secondary type system in this map, so it's all just where the points of contact are where enemies can come out. So let's have a look at the general T side setup. So there's 2 main setups, which which I use quite often. So we've got a brown holes, main, and ivy setup. So this typical 2-1-2 will be to target a lot of different areas of the map. This is going to allow you to put pressure on ivy. You can maybe send your AWP or a rifler towards main to get sort of map control and presence in main so that they're not easily taking it. And you can also put a hell of a lot of pressure on brown holes, the B site, for example, putting pressure on lower and upper, and pop. And a setup like this is going to allow a lot of basic conditioning, so you can easily throw with setups like this. Smokes early round from the players towards ivy and main over towards the site, which means you can consistently keep up a conditioning type presence where you can throw these basically with any of the players around any parts of the map, and you will have enough utility going into the late round for executes. So that's the general setup, 2-1-2, but a more commonly used one is 2-2-1. And what that typically will be is 2 towards the upper B area, so brown holes pop, 2 towards main and 1 towards ivy. Now this isn't the only 2 setups that there are. We will go into more setups later, but this is going to follow that same format. You're going to be able to put a lot of pressure towards B with this type of setup, a lot of pressure towards main. You can get a guy out towards Olaf. You can be fighting towards these locations right here with the 2 guys in main. You can also have your AWP peaking angles like this, here, and here. And your ivy guy can obviously keep up that presence. So again, general setup, nothing really too important for that. So let's talk about zoning. Now, we've talked about zoning a lot in previous maps, and for this map it's again the exact same concept, and it's quite important when you're attacking a site to really understand how to zone out an opponent. So I'm just going to highlight the zoning areas, and then we're going to talk over what zoning is, and we're going to talk about how we can use this. So we've got connector, we have backlines towards A, we have backlines towards B, we have B upper, we have pop, and we have main. So these are all your areas in which you can zone the opponents when you're entering a site, and I call these secondary zones. So what zoning is basically the ability to either cut off the rotations from the opponent, or it's the ability to make the opponents not able to perform the retake that they want to choose. So for example, let's say we're entering the A site. When we enter the A site, we'll typically have main. If we don't have main, we might have pop, and if we don't have pop, we'll have ivy. You have to come through one of these 3 entrances in order to get A, unless you are for some reason going through B. But typically, you're going to potentially already be close enough to backlines to take it. You will probably have pop as you come through pop, and you'll probably have main as you've come through main. So the main 2 locations in which you're going to want to take, or you're going to want to put pressure on when you're taking a site, will be connector and will be backlines. Now, what I mean by zoning is basically when you're a player, let's say you've taken the A site as a T. When you're the CT player and you want to rotate towards A, you have 3 main options. You can go through connector, you can go up towards B and through pop, or you can go through the backlines. Now, let's say if we were coming through ivy and we were putting pressure on A and we got A site, let's say we take the backlines at this point. Now, if we take the backlines, or maybe we don't take the backlines, but we put a Molotov in this area right here, what it's going to do is it's going to stop this rotation from happening, or it's going to put pressure on them to try and take a risk, maybe go through the Molotov, or maybe go back and towards connector. Now, again, if we have backlines and we don't have backlines and we want to put pressure on connector because connector is one of the easiest places to do it, again, if you put a Molotov into connector, it's going to be the same situation. If that B player wants to rotate, he's going to have to either push through that Molotov, he's going to have to smoke that Molotov, in which then he doesn't have a smoke to use for the retake, or he's going to have to wait behind it, and that's going to put pressure on the timing. And again, the same for pop. So the exact same situation, but with pop it's quite good because you can either molly into pop or you can molly over the top of pop. Now, again, you do this when you've taken the A site, it's going to make it incredibly difficult for the opponents to rotate. If this B player wants to go up towards pop, it's going to delay him massively. It should probably tell you if you've mollied, let's say pop, for example, and you haven't seen any opponent rotate from B, then there's a good chance he's waiting behind the Molotov. So this is what I mean by zoning. It's basically cutting off those rotations so that the enemies can't easily rotate. Now, I want to mention a couple of things when we're talking about this. I mentioned Molotov pop. I mentioned maybe a Molotov or a smoke backline, potentially. You can also smoke smoke connector as well, and the same for pop. So you can either smoke or Molotov. Now there is a couple things I do want to mention here. So we're gonna head over into the server for this. So let's put this scenario where we want a Molotov connector. Now let's say you've taken a site, and now as a terrorist you have a Molotov and you throw, let's say, a shallow Molotov like this. Now this can be good, because you obviously are cutting off this huge area right here, but there's a potential that this Molotov might not land, and the enemies can either wait behind it right here, or they could maybe wait back here, or they can still be in a good position just behind the Molotov in order to straight afterwards start retaking. So this means that a shallow Molotov might not be the best idea, especially as well if you do it too shallow, let's say here for example, and they have this whole area right here. They can also smoke out here and give them an instant smoke, which they could then use to throw pop flashes through, for example. They can do a double click pop flash, which would allow them to get out easily, and they can also boost over this position right here. So when you're throwing a Molotov into connector or into the backlines, you want to be aware of this. If you do your Molotov too shallow when you're trying to cut off those rotations, it could work out bad for you. So what I would recommend, throwing a deeper Molotov, what this is going to do is, if the enemy are going to use their smoke, they're not going to be able to use that smoke like effectively. They're going to have to go through the smoke, and then they don't have any protection from this point right here, which means they've used the smoke to extinguish a Molotov for no reason. What's typically going to happen is they're going to have to wait behind it, or they're going to have to make a decision at that moment, do I go through and potentially lose about 50 health? So in almost all situations, a deep Molotov connector is the preferable choice. And the same with a smoke. Let's say you throw a smoke right in this position here. They can still sit behind it and they can do whatever they want. Now you could chain this to make it a bit more effective with a couple of grenades. Let's say you throw that smoke, no enemies are behind it, and you throw some grenades in there. Or you potentially throw a Molotov behind it. This will work. However, again, let's push that smoke a little bit further back. Let's push it back to this area right here. The enemy have to take a lot of risk when they're evaluating, do we push through this smoke or not. If they're rotating from B, you have to think in the moment, could there be enemies right behind it? Like, what's the risk that I have to take in order to go through this smoke, or do I just wait behind it and then wait for my retake slowly? So, deep molly, deep smoking connector, definitely recommended if you can do it. Obviously when you can't do it, no point in even trying. Now let's look at a backline, very similar situation. If you can't get into this whole backline, you can't get control of it, then what I would recommend is throwing a smoke which lands a bit deeper, let's say either around this area right here or potentially this area right here, because again, the enemies have to evaluate at that moment, do I push through it and there's potentially an enemy behind it, or do I go back towards connector and then you can filter the enemies through one choke point. Now if you do a little bit of a smoke which let's say lands here, the enemies can play with this. They can easily go left, they can go through the smoke into the back line, potentially avoiding this area right here where you could be sat at old bomb, and then they only have to fight this one angle. They can also do decent pop flashes which go right through this, let's say if there's two enemies. So doing a smoke which lands in this area or a Molotov which lands in this area might not be the most preferable idea, so I would definitely recommend putting those Molotovs, those smokes further back. And similar situation for pop. Basically the general idea here is when you're zoning an opponent out, try to push them further away from the site as possible, because if you do only cover the shallow areas, let's say here, as mentioned before, they're still going to be able to sit behind that and still potentially have the utility because they didn't need to use it pushing. Now if we go over to the B site, it's the same thing. Let's say you throw a Molotov which lands right here. Now that can be quite beneficial for the opponents if they have a smoke. They can smoke right here. That means if you have an AWP, let's say holding lower in this angle right here, maybe on top of white train or maybe even here, then your AWP isn't going to be able to get those kills. So one thing which especially a lot of professional teams are doing at the moment is they'll be mollying either back here, which means if they come out of connector they're going to have to either fight or they're going to have to throw a smoke out which lands here, the counter terrorist, and then they're going to have to jump behind it, in which they're going to get burned by the Molotov, so they'll probably wait. Or you can do what's commonly done nowadays where you basically molly deep into connector and you have a very similar situation. So if they want to smoke this, their smoke isn't going to be able to be used more beneficially. They are using a smoke inside of connector, so they're not getting any benefit from this. They're going to have to evaluate, could an enemy be close, let's say around this area, or could they be deep heaven, for example here. So definitely again, deep Molotov is a lot more beneficial to you than a shallow one, especially on the B site, because they're going to be able to use that Molotov to throw a smoke into it and easily get out of connector. And again, similar situation for backlines. So the Molotov which lands here is going to be very good. If you're throwing a Molotov there, again, a smoke would also be very good. Smoke at this location right here is the terrorist side. Then they're going to have to take a big risk if they do get back here, for example. Then they have to make the decision, do we go through this or do we wait behind it? So zoning, definitely a big thing on this map, and you should take care of this when you're in a site. If you find yourself, you have a smoke left, you have a Molotov left, think about how you can use these to basically isolate the opponents away from your site and allow yourselves to have a much better hold. So let's go back into the train overview and we'll talk about a couple of other things. So we talked about zoning for the CT and T side. What I would say is we move over towards map control. So the good thing about train is it's a similar map to sort of, let's say, the Dust 2 type map. So when the enemy take X or when the enemy do X, we can also potentially do Y. And this is a reason why I really like train, because it's a constantly flowing map. Unless if the CTs want to play very, very defensive and play really, really far back in the A site or the B site, then it's going to be very easy for you to gain some ground, gain map control on those sites, and you're going to be able to push really, really simply into those sites. So it's a map of trade-offs. If they take X, then you could take Y, or if they take Z, then you could take V. The idea here is that there's always something that you can do in reaction to what the opponents are doing. So if you ever feel out of options, there probably is an option. You just have to think a little bit more, what can I do in this situation? So what we're going to do is we're going to talk over a couple of different map control areas, why they're good, what they do, and what they work well against. And then we're going to basically go into different setups which are going to allow you to either react very well to what the opponents are doing, or how you can start these off with some good setups. So let's talk about CT side. So we have the pop area, we have the main, we have the Ivy area, which you can maybe extend to, let's say, here if you're really pushing, and you have B holes. So let's start with pop. Now, if you as a counter-terrorist side are taking pop, there's a couple things which this is going to really benefit. Now, let's say if they take main, they can easily sandwich you pop, so this maybe isn't a good idea. So let's get the negatives out the way first, actually. So if the opponents have main and they have a lot of presence in main, and they also have maybe presence up here, then it might not be very good to be sitting directly inside pop. The reason why, they can easily molly down into pop from above pop, and they can easily peek out main. So what I would say is, if you are taking pop and they do have main control and they are above this area right here, then you should probably be doing some form of double setup. So one pop, one maybe this area right here, or potentially with an AWP on top of red, or maybe an Olaf. Now this is going to allow you that if they do try to react and get you out of pop, you can easily counter this. So that's the main thing that you need to take. If you have pop control, you need to be a main of a potential attack from the main area. So that's the main point right here. But let's talk about pop in general. So pop's going to allow you to get information towards B. It's going to allow you to count how many people are using utility towards B. It's going to allow you to put pressure towards the main guys to maybe try and fight out towards A. It's going to allow you to gain information for above pop, but obviously they're going to probably have to have a dedicated player sat towards pop in case you push up. So there's a lot of things that taking this one position is going to do, and it's just going to be super good for information gain. So those are the main points. We're obviously going to talk about protocols, and we're going to talk about how we can get into them and use them properly a little bit later on. But we'll just skip through these. So let's talk about main. Now, as a counter-terrorist, if you take main, there's a couple of things which are going to be really good here. Now, if they try to take Ivy, and they also have pop, it's going to be very difficult for these players and these players to coordinate. If the Ts want to peek Ivy, and they want to peek pop at the same time, but you have main control, then they're going to have to focus on main, which means anyone who's towards site can easily kill the pop guys, and anyone also towards site can easily focus on the Ivy guys, with potential that these players aren't going to be focusing their sole focus on your site players. And the reason why is, when you have site control, when they want to do any form of hit between Ivy and Pop, they're going to have to be completely aware that you could be out here, you could be an Olaf, you could be deep in main that you could push behind, for example. It's going to allow you to cut off that whole crossfire. So if you see that they're taking Ivy control, they're taking sort of Pop control, or maybe even B holes, then it might be in your interest at that moment, okay, let's take main, because it's going to cut the ability for them to do any form of crossfire. It's going to really hammer their ability to split sight from these two locations, because they're going to have to be hyper aware of this area right here and of the main bomb train. These two positions alone can completely hammer these two positions right here. So I would say that's a good protocol. We'll obviously get into that a little bit later on. But the main thing, it's also good for information. If you hear anyone basically rotating back from Ivy, you've got that information. You're going to hear anyone in the hallway. They're going to have to take it very, very slow. Let's say these Ivy players want to go towards the B holes, but you have main control. Then it's going to take them between 30 to 40 seconds if they have to walk the whole way. So main control, again, super useful for stalling time. So if you see there's not a lot of time left, then again, main control might be a good idea, because if they are going to have to hit B quick, or they're going to have to rotate quick towards A, they're going to have to be super aware of main, that they could be getting any form of information, and they could be cutting off those crossfires and those splits. And finally, B holes, similar situation. One information. If you take B holes control, they're going to have to retake it if they want to do any form of late round stuff. So basically, if the time's running down, let's say 30 seconds, and they still haven't retaken B holes, then either they're going to be doing an A execute very, very quickly, or they're going to have to retake B holes before attacking B. So you can basically stack your players towards A, and you could potentially at that point rotate your CT player out back towards B site, because the second they start using the utility towards the B holes, you know they're there. Which is why B holes is a good one for the late game. It can also be good for the early game, because it's going to mean that the enemies are going to have to use a lot of utility. If they understand that you're playing around the B holes area, then again, at some point they might have to retake that, and if they do, you can just absolutely hammer their ability to retake it without using big parts of big utility. So flashbangs, maybe a Molotov, maybe some nades, and then the B players are going to be very low on utility at that point. And now the big one again, information. So if you take B holes, you're going to gain a lot of information, especially if you post a AWP up here, for example, looking towards the highway area, or potentially this lower peak right here. Then you're going to gain a lot of information. You can basically play one guy towards B and 4 towards A. And if you have a guy close, for example, in this area right here, you're going to hear if they're in pop dog. If they're going down the ladder, they're going to have to go slow, otherwise you're going to get all the information that's required. And you're just going to be able to easily play 4 towards A. So those are the main map control for CT side. A couple of different ideas there, a couple of different things that they do. But those are the general overview points. Now let's have a look at for the T side control. It's very, very similar in the fact that it's the same sort of areas, but it's a little bit more pushed out towards the CT area. So you have first line, which is this area right here. Or we can include also the hallway towards Ivy. We have Olaf and main. We have Pop. And we have the B holes. So when you're a terrorist, again, these 4 areas are going to really put a lot of pressure on the A site. As I mentioned at the beginning, there's 5 entrances, which means if you take any of these areas, then you're going to open up, you're going to really hammer those entrances, which means let's say you take main control. Now, you haven't pushed past this entrance point, which means they can still have one player watching this. However, let's say you get a player into Olaf. Now, because you've passed this entrance point, you're relatively safe in Olaf. They're going to have to use a Molotov. They're going to have to peek maybe on top of the trains, or they're going to have to push down here. They might have to Molotov from the Ivy area, which would then distract the Ivy player, for example. And they're going to have to obviously use a lot of info to gain the info on you. So let's say you take Olaf, you push past this entry point right here, as we mentioned at the beginning. They're going to have to do a lot of things in order to gain the information to figure out what the hell's going on. They're going to have to use utility. They're going to have to push to gain information. So again, a really good area to take, especially if you're looking to put pressure on A. You can take this at the early game. You can take this at the late game. This is just a really good area to get a player into with relatively low risk. The enemies are going to have to use risk in order to get a fight with you, and you can exploit that. So let's talk about the sort of first line to Ivy area. So again, the entry zone is this point right here, where I've highlighted in green. So when you push past that point into the first line, then they're going to have to be aware of these potential 2 new entry zones, which means they're going to have to focus on 4 areas on A if you take first line. They're going to have to be more aware, and they're going to have to use more players in order to defend the A site if they want to defend it properly. They're either going to have to put a guy in heaven and potentially watch 2 positions, which could be quite dangerous, or they're going to have to push a guy back lane and have to retake this area. And if they want to do that, they're potentially going to have to use utility, or they're going to have to smoke off these areas in order to defend them properly. So taking Ivy, super good place to take if you're the T side, because it's going to put, again, an immense amount of pressure on the A site. They're going to have to panic, they're going to have to retake it, they're going to have to peek, they're going to have to take risks. It's also really good for gaining info. Obviously, if you meet a guy here, then there's a good chance that he's rotated from B. It's unlikely that he's going to rotate through connector towards this area, so if you peek here and they have a guy here, you can bet that's one or potentially all of the B players right there, and then you could obviously push in from B at that point. So really, really good place to take map control. Now, Main and Olaf we already talked about. Here we already talked about, so let's talk about Pop. Again, it's basically the opposite of what the CTs are. So if you take Pop control, you obviously have to be aware of Main. If they have Main control, it's probably not preferable to fight from both this location right here and this location, because they can easily peek you from Main. So what Pop's really good at is you push the enemies back onto the site. They're going to have to be aware of this area right here. They're going to have to use a smoke. They're going to have to use a molly. Otherwise, defending from this angle right here, they usually have to defend from these tight angles like here, or maybe on bomb site, or maybe even from heaven. So in order to fully defend the Pop area once you've taken it from them, they're going to have to use a smoke, or they're going to have to make more players aware that they could potentially be attacked instantly through this area right here. So again, Pop's really good at pushing the A players back towards the site and making it a little bit harder for them to defend. And B holes. So B holes isn't necessarily CT side map control, but it's a good area of the map in which both teams would preferably like to have information. So the reason why it's really good for T side is you can put a lot of pressure on the B side from this area. You can peek out heaven, for example. You can throw a smoke down into lower, and you can maybe peek behind it. You could do a one-way smoke. You could get a player down into B quite easily after you get this area right here. You can take the B holes and then leave it. There's a good chance that the opponents aren't going to push unless they have no form of information, which then means you can exploit this. You could take the B holes, leave it, and then go silent across the whole map, hoping that the B player might push, for example, because that's an easy place to push in order to gain information. And you can easily get a quick rotate into B if your B player dies doing a push. So again, another area which is super, super good to take. So now let's take some of those map controls which we talked about on the CT side, and let's talk about how we can do them quick at the beginning of the rounds, or maybe how we can use them in protocol form. So we talked about Pop. We're gonna go over a double setup and a single setup. So there's 2 main ways that professional teams do this right now. They will either rush a guy in there super, super quick, and they'll just basically dry their way in there and get in there quick, and they'll either do this with 1 player, or they'll do this with 2. So what you will typically get is a setup like 1 player in Pop, or 1 player next to Pop, for example here, playing anti-flash, and you'll have 1 player towards this area right here, or you might have 1 player in Pop and 1 player towards, let's say, the sandwich or the red train. Now, this is going to mean that if they want to peek out main, they're going to have to fight this guy right here, and if they do kill in Pop, then you can get an easy refrag. So you can either take it quick with a single setup, and you can have this guy basically playing towards Ivy or playing anywhere on site that he wants, or you can go with 2 players. Now, I would definitely recommend having 2 players here. The reason why is because you're going to have to defend these 2 entry points anyway, 1 here and 1 here. So you may as well have these players playing together where they can. If this guy takes contact, he can turn. If this guy takes contact, he can refrag or potentially assist with flashbangs or nades or molotovs. So decent setup overall, but single and double setup is basically the way I would go. If you look into a couple of pro teams, they might molly it early, and this is basically conditioning the opponents to think, okay, the CTs are always mollying it, so I'm not just going to jump down the ladder and go straight into pop. So that's a really good way of conditioning the opponents to not want to take pop control. Now let's talk about a couple of protocols. So let's say the opponents take B holes. So this would be a good time to take, if they're a heavy B hole taking team, so let's say at the beginning or late round you notice that the opponents are always taking B holes, then pop would be a really good place to take at that point in the game, because if you haven't been taken up to this point, it's going to be very hard for you to gain info. Let's say they take B holes and then they run back, and you don't have any form of pop presence, you're not going to hear any form of information there. So what I would say is if they're a heavy B holes team, then an option that I would suggest, take pop. If you have been taking pop and you've been leaving it, and then late game you've noticed that they either take B holes or they're retaking B holes, then start playing pop in the late round, because it's going to, again, cut off a lot of information. The only thing I would say is just be aware of the main peaks. The main peaks are super easily, as I said, easy to do. They can throw a Molotov into pop right here, and they can easily peek out from here. So be aware of that potential. And for late round info, so it might not be necessarily B hole, but let's say you peek pop maybe a minute into the round, so 50 seconds or 40 seconds left on the clock, and you're not hearing or seeing anything. Then there's a couple of potential things right now. They could be setting up for a smoke setup. They could be heavy Ivy, or they could be set up in the B holes. So you can prep your B players, you can prep your A players for an execute, and you can then hold in pop in case there's a main execute right here. And you can maybe double up Ivy if you're getting no information or no calls, because if they execute at this point, it'll be very easy to defend late round against multiple opponents with 2 Ivy. So that's the pop. Pretty simple. Some basic protocols, some basic setups. I was talking about main, same situation. So it's either the main 2, which are happening right now, especially at the pro level or sort of the semi-professional level, is a triple and double push. So what is typically happening is you'll have 2 players being supported by a third, for example, either with flashbangs or pop flashes or Molotovs, double Molotovs or nades. This is the typical thing which is happening. A lot of the times it's a smoke is being thrown towards the pallet area in the main, and then 2 players are pushing in, or 3 players are all pushing in quick and then quickly coming back out with maybe 2 and leaving 1 behind. So double and triple setups definitely recommended for the early round, or if you're going for any form of main control. You can do it single, but what I would recommend is using a little bit more utility, because if they have 2 guys main, they can easily kill your single player, and there's not very much you can do as far as refragging. And let's talk about the IV pop protocol. So we mentioned this before. If you have main as a CT, and they have IV and pop, then these 2 are separated. It's going to be very difficult for them to coordinate together, because they're going to have to obviously be aware of a connector, heaven, or bomb train. These 3 positions and main together are going to be super powerful, because this people in pop are going to have to focus towards main, people in IV are going to have to focus towards site, or they're going to have to go back around and potentially all the way towards B. But then you can easily get a rotate if you have lots of guys on site. So if they take IV, could be instantly, let's take main. If they take pop, again, instantly take main, because in a situation where they're in pop and you take main and then they want to push Ivy, it's going to make it a lot more difficult for them, and vice versa. If they have Ivy and you take main and now they decide, okay, we want to take pop at this point, it's going to be, again, very, very difficult for them. So taking main could potentially push the enemy side towards the B holes. So again, really good protocols. If the enemy take X or Y, then you take Z. Now Ivy, I really like Ivy because there's a lot of things that you can do. So you can do a single push. You can either do this as the Ivy player with a rifle, or you can do it with an AWPer. So wherever your AWPer plays, typically you'll play connector or the back of green. He can obviously push that solo. Now I'd recommend doing this as often as you can. Obviously not every round, but let's say 1 or 2 times a game if you can. You're going to get a lot of information from this. It's going to condition the opponents to be thinking, okay, they're going to be doing an Ivy push, so we have to put a player there, otherwise they're going to get all the information that they need. So Ivy push is definitely recommended. Double push, you could do the same. So basically, instead of 1 player do it on his own, you could either go up close with 2, with the support of a third, or you could have one support in from a little bit further back with good pot flashes. So again, super easy single or double pushes, and potentially also one with an AWP. So how do we work Ivy into the protocols? So let's say the opponents are going heavy Ivy. I'm talking 2 or 3 players. Then taking Ivy as a protocol might be a good idea here. Now the reason why is you can also time this. You can, let's say, typically enemies are holding, maybe if they have 3 players, they might be playing 1 anti-flash. They'll be holding for maybe the first 5 to 10 seconds. So after that point, that could be a good time to do an Ivy protocol. So you've noticed on the default or on how they play their T side, they're going very heavy towards Ivy. Then I would recommend trying to push that back with a protocol, trying to push and take this area off them, because it's going to force these players, if they are going to fight, they're going to have to use a hell of a lot of manpower in order to do that. They're going to have to be playing anti-flash, they're going to have to be using a lot of utility, potentially mollying here early round, flashing here early round, and just wasting a hell of a lot of utility they don't have to waste. So my big protocol, if they're going heavy Ivy, is to fight Ivy, is to take Ivy. Now another one, main, as we talked about before, if the enemies on the T side have main, then what I would say is, again, if they're heavy main, let's say 1 to 2 players, then typically we're going to have to look towards a default. They're going to be playing maybe 1-2-2, or they're going to be flipping it around, so they might have 2 here and 1 here. So it could be in your interest to push Ivy if they're going heavy main, because there's a good chance you're only going to be fighting either 1 or 2 guys, and with good pot flashes, good molotovs, good smokes, whatever it is, you can also smoke, I believe, this area from the A site. You can easily push in here and gain all the info that you need to make sure that there's no plays in this area. So if they take heavy main, or they're having a good presence in main, maybe an AWPer, etc., then you can be pretty sure that they're not going to have an AWPer here, which means pushing in, good idea. And late round information. So what you'll typically find is, let's say after sort of the minute mark or so, the Ts will be deciding at that point, okay, are we pushing Ivy here, are we going back towards main, or are we going back towards B? So you could take that risk of the late round information. You hear nothing, there's nothing going on. Ivy is a good place to push. If you push B, there's a good chance they could be still in B holes, because in the late round it's very easy to rotate down into pop or attack B through heaven or here very quickly. So B isn't an easy late round push, whereas Ivy is. They either have to be defending from all the way back here, or they have players in here ready for a late round push, because it's not very easy to rotate all the way around, so they're not going to have the time. They're going to either have to be in here already, or holding from a distance, or not there at all. So Ivy can be a very good position that if you have no info at all, then push. Push the Ivy position, you'll gain a lot of information from it. Either you're going to be instantly killed, or you might be able to get a 1-to-1 trade, or you could potentially see no one and then you can rotate your plays quickly through. So late round Ivy push for information gain, big one in my books, is really good. A lot of professional teams do it. And now the B holes. So again, similar situations as before. You're not really going to get a triple push with this unless you're on pistols, let's say. So you're typically going to see maybe an AWP single push, or a rifle single push through heaven, maybe a rifle just holding here, or a double push. So you might see a double push from down below. Now what you can do, which I recommend having a look on YouTube for a smoke for this, but you can also have a player in this position right here and connector instantly throw a smoke which lands here. And then you can also chain this with a double push with 2 players down here or 2 players up here, or a 1-to-1 split. And that's going to allow you to get easy B holes control without using any smokes on the B players or your rotator, which then means if this is your rotator, for example, he's still going to have his smoke for the late round, and your B player is also still going to have his smoke for the late round. So single push with an AWP or double push, definitely recommended. You can also, as I said, single push with a rifle, still very good. Now, this is good, as I mentioned before, it's going to give you a lot of information. If they want to take Pop Dog, they're going to have to be aware that you could push behind, so they're going to have to be holding with at least 1 player. If they want to take B holes after you've made it obvious that you have B holes, they're going to have to throw at least 1 flash, or maybe a smoke. Maybe a Molotov. If you're playing, let's say, back here, then they're going to have to molly this area right here to make sure that you don't peek as they take into B holes. So they're going to have to use utility to retake it. Now, let's say you take Ivy, then they don't necessarily have to use utility in order to retake this. There's a lot of places that you can take easy angels, whereas when you're turning these corners, you're typically going to be up against an AWP, and it's going to be a lot harder to angel, so utility is the way the T side is going to have to go and retake in this. Now we can also do a pinch. Now what I mean by that is, let's say they take B holes and they take it with 2 players. Then, as we mentioned before, the typical default is 2-on-2. So let's say your B player notices that 2 people are taking B holes from here. Then what you could do is you could pinch this. So you could also have, let's say, a CT player up here, maybe one in pop, and the pop guy could push up pop, and this guy could push at the same time, and maybe even this guy as well. And what you can do is a triple man pinch. So a protocol here is when they take B holes with 2 players, you can take the risk as the CT side to instantly push them back by pinching them from 3 different positions. Now, this could work out both ways. It could be really, really in your favor because they could have no one holding pop, for example, and you can easily pinch them down and kill both their players. Or they could be lucky and they could be holding 3 towards B, in which if this guy jumps up pop and sees a guy instantly and dies, then there's a good chance that these 2 players will be able to react quick enough knowing that there's 3 towards a B site, and then you could also, let's say, push Ivy in this moment or push main, because you're going to gain a lot of information. So pinching is not a bad idea, because you're going to gain a lot of information from it, and it's a little bit high risk, but you're going to gain, as I said, you're probably going to gain more than you're going to lose. If you do lose a play, you can easily rotate through. If you lose, let's say, pop control because your guy dies towards pop, you're going to know that there's 3 enemies towards B. So you're going to be pretty good to go there if they take B holes. And heavy Ivy protocol and heavy main. As I said before, let's say they take heavy Ivy. Let's say they go in 2 or 3 players. Then you can be pretty sure that there might be either 1 holding outside main, maybe 1 holding pop, or maybe 1 B holes. It's very, very rare that, let's say, they go 3 towards Ivy and they go 2 towards B holes, because they're leaving main completely exposed, they're leaving pop completely exposed, and they're leaving the whole map very, very exposed, which means you can base off that assumption, if they're taking the B holes, that you could either heavy push Ivy or heavy push main at that point. Sorry, you can push into B holes if they're going heavy in these positions right here. That's what I meant to say. So, as I mentioned, you see heavy here, you see heavy here. There's a good chance there's really going to be only 1 guy, or potentially 2 maximum, if they're putting heavy pressure in these areas, because it wouldn't make sense for an enemy team to be going really, really heavy main and then have also 2 guys here, as I mentioned, because then Ivy's going to be open, and Ivy is a place that you don't really want to lose control of on the T side, because the CTs are going to gain tons of control of that. So that's some really basic protocols. I don't want to go into too much detail and say every single protocol that you can do, but those are some very, very simple things that if the enemy do so and so, then as a counter-terrorist that you can do so. And there's a couple of different ways that you can start off your round with some pushes. So obviously nothing groundbreaking here. The purpose of this is to give an overview, just to show a couple of different things that you can do. So yeah, I hope there's a couple of things in there which maybe you have overlooked or maybe not thought of before. We're going to finish this up with some T side defaults, and we're going to talk about, you know, how you can sort of use them. So this is going to be really, really simple. So we mentioned a lot for the 2-on-2. So this is going to be a pretty easy one for most teams. This is going to allow you for a hell of a lot of pressure. So you could potentially, if you gain, let's say, info that they're playing 2 towards Ivy, and your main guy, let's say, knows that there's someone playing towards this area right here, then you know that there's definitely 3 towards A. And in knowing sort of this info, then there's a good chance that you've got 1 towards connector and you've got 1 towards B, which means these 2 B players could, let's say, both push up heaven at this point. They could both push out lower. You could, let's say, throw a smoke down to here, for example, and try and get one of your guys out. There's a lot of ways that you can play this type of default. Again, if you're playing 2 towards B, and you flip the situation around where you notice that they're playing all of a sudden 2 guys on B, or they're pushing quick towards heaven and maybe lower, and you have info that they're instantly 3 two guys towards B at the maybe early round or mid round, then you can push Ivy very, very quickly. Or you can have these two positions right here pinch. So this is a general, very, very basic default, which is going to allow for very easy map control everywhere. You can put pressure in all locations and not have to worry too much. So if you're going to look for a default, this would be my recommendation. It's going to allow for very, very simple stuff. Well, there's a couple of variations which we can add to this. So there's the 3-1-1. Now there's two setups. There's 3 towards here or 3 towards here, and then you're basically 1 and 1 on 1. So what we mean by this is either you could go heavy towards Ivy, you could go heavy towards B holes, and then you can basically base your opposite positions as 1 and 1. So you can have 1 towards main and 1 towards here, or 1 towards main and 1 towards here, towards B holes. Now what this is going to allow you to do is going to put you able to put your team a lot more focus on where is important. So I'd recommend doing this type of default. Let's say you've noticed the opponents are putting heavy pressure towards the main and pop area. Now what might be good is putting then heavy pressure towards Ivy, because it's going to have to make these guys aware that they might have to pull back at any point. Or let's say you notice that they're playing 4 towards A, then heavy towards B holes. Again, a good recommendation, because it's going to allow, you're going to know that there's probably going to be a guy rotating, which means all you're going to have to do if you contact, let's say B, is fight versus one guy and then have to deal with the rotate later. So altering your default so that you can have more people towards one area is one of my strong recommendations if you notice the opponent's doing something. It's definitely worth being able to play this type of setup, because if you are just too evenly spread and you just do your default 2-on-2, then there can be a couple of situations, as I mentioned, where let's say they're playing 4 towards A, or they're playing heavy attacking towards this area. Then the standard default of the 2-on-2 might not be as effective with this type of information. Now, there's another setup which is quite common towards the pro level, and it's very, very good for one thing, which is conditioning. Now, what this is typically 3 towards Ivy and 2 towards the B area. So that doesn't necessarily mean B holes, it doesn't necessarily mean pop, it's just one of the two. It's just a variant of the two. So for example, you could go 1 and 1, or you could go 2 towards here or 2 towards here. Basically what this is going to allow you to do is condition very, very quickly towards the A site. Now what I mean by that is a lot of professional teams at the moment are, let's say, smoking towards this area right here and smoking towards this area through, let's say, the Ivy players or the B players are doing this type of smoke setup very quickly. And then they're going to have to be aware, are you in main? Are you in pop? Are you towards Ivy? And this is going to allow you to either attack heavy Ivy very, very quickly, because they're going to have to be fighting and watching towards these areas, or you can easily fight towards B and put pressure on Ivy at the same time. Now, they're going to have to be aware, as counter-terrorists, could there potentially be terrorists within these areas right here, which means they can't necessarily focus their whole attention on Ivy, and they can't have their rotator instantly rotate off towards B at the risk that potentially this terrorist could peek around this side of the smoke, for example. So this type of setup is good for conditioning, because you can make the opponents hyper aware that they could be attacked at any point. You can also chain these smokes differently. For example, you could throw a smoke, let's say here, and you could throw a smoke, let's say here at the beginning of every round. And what that's going to do is it's going to separate Ivy from the site, and then that could mean that with your 3 plays towards Ivy and your 2 plays towards B, you can easily chain a B hit with a back push, for example. So there's a lot that you can do off this type of default conditioning wise, and there's a lot of different variations that you can do with your smokes to condition the opponents. And the final one is basically 2-2-1 or 1-1-2, 1-2-2. So what this is either 2 players here, 2 here and 1 here, or 2 here, 2 here and 1 here. So it's a very, very similar variation to the standard map control, but you're putting more focus towards this main area. Now you're going to want to do this if you have a very confident AWP. This is a really good one for supporting, having a guy in main with an AWP play, for example, supporting the AWP. Or let's say you know the opponents really like to play pop, then it could be worth having a default which is more focused towards main. As I mentioned earlier when we were talking about protocols, if the enemies have pop, then it's very, very easy with main players to sandwich this area. You can pinch this from guys attacking above pop and guys attacking out main to easily catch off any players which are sat here alone. Obviously, they can counter this with crossfires, but if you have only 2 main, and then you have 2 towards B-holes or 2 towards Ivy, and 1 in the opposite position, then you can also be pressuring all areas of the map as you potentially pinch pop, for example. You can be pressuring towards B so that their rotator can't easily walk up to support his pop guy, or you can be pressuring Ivy to keep, let's say, an AWP or the Ivy player stuck towards the back lane area or stuck towards the back of this train right here, and then they can't focus on the main. So again, this setup is really good for if the enemy are playing towards the pop area, or if they're putting heavy pressure towards sort of the mid site, the mid area right here. And that's basically all we're going to go over today. Obviously, as I mentioned, this is a map overview. In the future, I will be making series which are going to go a lot more deep diving into, let's say, things that we mentioned, conditioning, we mentioned protocols, I mentioned a little bit on zoning. We're going to deep dive more vigorously on those topics, but that is obviously for the future. It's going to take a long time to get through all of this stuff. Right now, this was just a quick hour so that we can basically go over all of the map basics. Introduce a couple of different protocols, introduce a little bit of conditioning, and we've achieved that in this lesson. The one thing I will say is this document right here, you're going to be able to find this in the description of this video. It will be in the YouTube description, so if you do want to follow along, if you're watching the VOD, then this is obviously here if you need it at the very end of this video. So yeah, that's basically all I've got for today. I hope that was an easy explanation of train. I hope there's a couple things in there which maybe you've overlooked or never even thought of before. And then in the future we will come back to train and we will talk about some more complex topics, or we'll talk about some more things in more detail. So that's all I've got for today, guys. Thanks for anyone who tuned into the live stream version, but the VOD will be available within the next week, and I will be posting it on Twitter and yeah, all my sources for anybody who's watching the live stream if you want to watch it back. So thanks a lot, guys. Remember to check out Vodafone. I would like to thank them for making this whole thing possible. Without them, it's kind of helpless here. So thanks a lot to Vodafone. And yeah, we'll see you guys in the next version of these map overviews. I think the next one will either be Vertigo or I believe Vertigo might be either my last map or one of my last maps. No, in fact, Dust 2 and Vertigo are my last 2 maps, so it'll either be Dust 2 or Vertigo next. Obviously, I'll make a decision on that at a later point. So thanks for tuning in, and I hope you learned something, guys. So see you in the next one.